So to the extent that you make them feel, it changes even those on the other side of the aisle. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That was the whole point of televising the civil rights movement, right? And televising
Mm,
sit-ins and the treatment, right? We didn't put that trauma on TV because we wanted to relive it.
mm,
It was put on TV so that people could see the cruelty. It's
mm,
easier to disassociate with things and people that aren't in front of you. It's easy to go bomb a country you've never been to. It's
mm,
easier to exploit people that you've dehumanized or
mm,
that you don't know. It's easier to say, get all the immigrants out the country when you just don't have any friends who are
mhm.
immigrants. Once you humanize, it's so much harder to discriminate.
This is Diversity Different with Demetria Frank and Daryl Jackson.
Welcome back to Diversity Different. We're here to talk about DEI with a little fun, a little depth, and a lot of truth.
Today, we're answering a question that we get all the time. Why focus on race?
We'll unpack the myth of the colorblind workplace and discuss why race is critical to equity.
What do you think? Can we achieve equity without focusing on race? Leave us your thoughts in the comments.
It's very fitting that we're talking about race today because it's Black History Month. So we decided to start this episode with discussing our personal reasons for centering race in our equity work and our DEI work. So, Daryl, what's your personal reasons? I know we all have a personal story why race is so important to this work for us and why this work is important. So, I don't know where you want to start with that.
I think I started to center race in my research when I was going through the PhD program. And it was at that time that I first learned about critical race theory and Derek Bell and the influence they had on the legal academy, even though my PhD was focusing on education. And it had just started really permeating the field of educational research. And it made sense to me to really dive into it in a way that centered my research on how does race factor into all the different parts of policy and analysis and the way that we teach students.
I think I've always been equity minded. So, the first thing I wrote was about preemption in medical device cases. Daryl read it and he was like, well, what's the race element to this? And my response was something like, there is no race element to this. This is just something, it's just a phenomenon that exists. And he was trying to convince me that there was a race slant to the topic and that maybe my next article should embrace that and talk about it. And we had like months of banter as to whether race interplayed with that topic, whether race interplayed with other topics. But I think you just wore me down
That's what
and
I do.
then I got to Memphis. I got to Memphis, Tennessee. And mind you, at the time we had this conversation months before, we
Right.
were both in Wyoming, teaching in Wyoming. And for those that don't know, Wyoming is a very white state. So I got to Memphis, and Memphis was a place where I think the first time in my life I had seen a place that felt like the racial constructs there were very much in play with everything. And it changed my entire perspective. And I think the next thing I wrote was completely centered on race. And I sent it to Daryl and he read, he said, that's critical race theory. And I was like, no, it's not. He was like, you're doing critical race theory. You're doing critical race theory. And so that just let me embrace it, and I'm not sure exactly when that transition happened, but I've been all on board ever since, but my intention wasn't to become a critical race theorist. I don't really consider myself a critical race theorist. I use a lot of critical race theory, and I think about critical race theory a lot. I read a lot on critical race theory,
All back
but
there
I don't know,
behind you.
I just had I know, I look right at it. I had so much respect
Mhm,
for the writers in the area that came before us that
mhm.
I just didn't put myself on that level with the Cheryl Harris, and I still don't, right?
Right. I appreciate that you hesitated enough that it made me really think about how to articulate what I was thinking, because I was
Mhm.
trying to convince you that the things you didn't think were there. Even if so subtly there, they were still there. And so it helped me think deeper about what I was doing, which is what we do with our students, right? So yeah, it was a fun journey working with you to get from there is no race involved to there's always race involved. That is the
There's
nature of
always
this
race
country.
involved. I'm there
Always.
with you now. We should turn to talking about what exactly is race. We hear people say all the time, race is a social construct. Like that's the new verbiage that we use when we acknowledge that race is something man made, man created, that essentially there's not very much different about our DNA. So what's your thoughts on what race is and the phrasing race is a social construct? What does that mean?
It's true. Race is a social construct. But what's happened is just like DEI, just like so many other terms, critical race theory, affirmative action, color blindness, all these terms have become weaponized. So
Mhm.
people use the verbiage, race is just a social construct, to push back on this idea that, well, we shouldn't think about it at all. We should be colorblind. It shouldn't be part of our dialogue.
Mm.
When while race is a social construct and the data and history and research all supports that, the other side of that same coin is race is a lived experience. For all the social constructions, it has implications.
Mhm.
And we have talked about it in the past, we'll talk about it in the future, we'll talk about it down the road, that it has implications for the criminal justice system. It has implications for the medical community. It has implications for buying a house. It has so many various implications that just saying it's a racial construct does little work. It is relevant, but it doesn't do the work. The data is still out there that demonstrates all the different ways that race affects life. And if you blow it off as a social contract and nothing more, then you haven't done the work.
Saying that it's a social construct, while we get it, and although that's true, as you said, it's like saying it's not real.
Right, right. And I appreciate that the social construction of race has gotten traction
Mhm.
because it really is somewhat the antidote to eugenics, right?
Mhm.
Eugenics took hold in this country.
Like, we wouldn't
pr-
need that phrase if
Right,
it wasn't for the history of eugenics and bad
right
science
there,
around race.
right there. And the words
Mhm.
you used is what caused so many problems. You just said eugenics and that's science. And that's what caused so many problems is
I said
eugenics
bad
became
science.
right,
I
but it
said
got
bad.
accepted for a long time as
Mhm.
science. And
Mhm.
as long as there were scientists who were willing to say the science shows that these other people aren't as smart, aren't as capable, aren't as wise, all these things that we as scientists can now say to show why they need to be in their place, then
Racial essentialism,
racial
right?
essentialism.
Racial essentialism, the justifying racial
Yes.
hierarchy.
Yes, the justification.
And that I think a lot of times critical race theorists sometimes, especially Black, get criticism from only looking at things in a racialized perspective between Black and white, but that's the foundation of this country. That's what was codified. And the initial history of eugenics in the United States and bad science was used to oppress and apply a racial hierarchy to essentially say Black people deserved slavery, deserved to be put in their place. And we see a lot of resemblance with how DEI is being discussed
Yes,
today.
yes,
If you're not white, that there's question on whether you deserve the positioning that you may have earned. Hate to keep bringing up Obama, but that brother didn't deserve to be in that place is what racial essentialism would say, that he's not supposed to be there. That and then the divinity aspect of that, right? Because that history of eugenics, bad science, racial essentialism was accompanied by messaging that this was God's order,
mm,
that this is biblical.
yes. I wanna pick up from your discussion about the black-white binary. I wanna talk about it in 2 different ways. One is the black-white binary becomes so highlighted because it is integral to the foundation of the country. Slavery, the fact that there was free labor, the fact that it's written into the Constitution of the United States of America demonstrates how much the black-white binary is key to this country. So when you hear people talk about it in terms of black and white, it is limiting, but it is real.
It's real.
Secondly, I want to talk about how that black white binary has been expanded because while critical race theory undoubtedly started off with the black white binary as its foundational analysis, you can see how CRT has broken off and created tribal crit, lat crit, fem crit. There are discrit researchers. There are so many other groups that have taken that black white binary analysis that it has far, far further reaching implications than just the black white binary. So I want to make sure we fully grasp the utility of it and how others have used it. The binary isn't something that just sociological researchers or psychological researchers have tapped into. We can look at legal research. There are plenty of cases out there, Thin being one, I think it's Ozawa's another one, where members of races other than the African American or Black race have petitioned the United States Supreme Court to be declared white.
Right. Mhm.
Why? Because the privileges that were at the highest level within the United States were resources that were being limited to only whites. That's the
Mhm.
United States Supreme Court. That's the US Congress, right? So
Mhm.
that's not us saying that. This is the US government saying to get these privileges, you must be white. And so people in other groups were saying, look at us because of where we're born. Look at us as where we come from. Look at us because of these other indicators. We're
What's the
white like
case
you.
of the Indian gentleman that was claiming to have Nordic ancestry? Mm,
Think that's Ozawa,
you
but I know
have
what you
cases of Asian immigrants
yes.
basically saying, "Well, we're not black, so."
Right. And that really became why you get the black white binary because more
Mhm.
importantly, right, even if you don't get to achieve we're white, the
It's
case law suggests you can at least say we ain't black. So at least we're above them.
reach. If we look at this in terms of who gets and who doesn't, right? You got white people at the top and how this country was created, how it was built, and you have black people at the bottom. And you got everybody in the middle who's fighting to get their piece and to enjoy certain privileges. So that binary, you have to understand the black white binary to understand any of the rest of it. You
Yes.
have to in America, you have to understand
Yes.
the black white binary to understand the situation in place of every other demographic in this country. You have to understand the black white binary to understand colorism,
Yes.
to even understand the intra issue of race and the
Yes.
treatment that might result from that. I do want to come back to our discussion of what is race. We talked about race being a social construct, and I want to add we've scientifically proven that race is a social construct. The Human Genome Project, was it like early 90s that
Mhm.
that began? It was like a 20-year study of
Mhm.
bioscanning. I'm probably using the wrong terminology, but it essentially resulted in a finding that race is not biologically identifiable. That based on examination of human DNA, any 2 human beings on the planet are 99.9% identical. So our racial makeup in our DNA, or as you used last time, racial structure,
That's trying to be politically correct.
our racial makeup is only such a small segment of us as human beings.
Yeah. Science has been pretty clear about Homo sapiens came from Africa. Like
Mm,
it all starts with humans walking out of Africa and starting to explore the rest of this planet. And
mhm.
as long as you try to tell people that at your basic foundation, you're from Africa, that's where conflict starts. Folks don't want to be from Africa, right? They want to be as I'm from Europe, I'm
I'm Nordic.
I'm Nordic, I'm all these other things, right? When no matter if you just keep going back, you come from Africa. And I think that Human Genome Project and the scientific articulation that every one of us comes out of Africa is part of why we get to that black white binary.
That's also one of the problems with the race as a social construct language, right? That it doesn't do anything
Mm.
because I don't care what science tells us and how we support it, people believe what they want to believe.
My hope is folks will put an and in there. And I'm big on and. I do and a lot when I'm discussing things. I hope they will say race is a social construct and it
Mhm.
is a lived experience. Do
Sure.
not deny either one of those because the fact that race is a social construct helps eliminate the fact that eugenics was bullshit.
Definitely both. I just don't think it matters. No one has cared about science lately.
They care about it when they
Um,
care about it, right? Like eugenics took off because, hey, we got science now that backs us up. And so they took policy in
well, that's the
education.
problem, right? That bad science doesn't have the cachet it used to have, right? Like when bad science
Mm,
happens, there's a whole community to be responsive to it, and we have channels to check it. So you
mm,
can't get away. So that's why we don't like science no more, right? Because now we can call your bull on the bad science. And so I don't think science for the people it needs to matter to,
mm,
the people who are worried about white extinction and replacement
mhm,
theory, all of those things, the
mhm,
science don't matter to them. They don't care that we're not different, right? They prefer us to be different so they can maintain their place in the hierarchy. So I love that we're putting this into the conversation because I think for the people who are doing this work and likely to watch this podcast, yes, that's something that matters and should matter to them. But for people who press on to uphold white supremacy,
uh-huh.
which is the problem, that's the problem, right? It doesn't matter. If one of the objective is to cross aisles,
Okay, okay.
I think I don't think the science is going to be the pull. I think we do a lot more with pulling people with matters of the heart
Mm.
than we do with pulling people on the footnote of science.
I think it's Toni Morrison who said what you just said, right? They're not gonna remember what you said, they're not gonna remember what they read, but they will remember how you made them feel. And that's what you
Right.
just said, right? It's gonna be about the heart. So to the extent that you make them feel, it changes even those on the other side of the aisle. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, because I mean, that was the whole point of televising the civil rights movement, right? And televising
Mm,
sit-ins and the treatment, right? We didn't put that trauma on TV because we wanted to relive it.
mm,
We didn't put that trauma on TV to let our kids be frightened and
mm,
see it, right? It was
yeah,
put on TV so that people could see the cruelty. It's
mm,
easier to disassociate with things and people that aren't in front of you. It's easy to go bomb a country you've never been to. It's
mm,
easier to exploit people that you've dehumanized or
mm,
that you don't know. It's easier to say, get all the immigrants out the country when you just don't have any friends who are
mhm,
immigrants. Once you humanize, it's so much harder to discriminate.
mm,
Part of debiasing is individuating. When we talk about debiasing people in organizations, the tactic is to get people to individuate. And how do you do
mhm,
that? You get to know them. How
mm.
do you do that? You interact, you engage, right? And it's so much harder to discriminate and mistreat people that you've actually experienced a human moment with.
When you humanize, it's so much harder to discriminate. I think that may be the tagline for this entire episode right there.
I can remember people saying, "I don't see color," for
Mm,
years, and that was actually laudable because for years it meant that I don't see you as different from myself. That was the idea, right? But the fact is we are different because of that lived experience, right? The way that I live and you live at the bottom of the racial hierarchy in America is very different from the experience of a white American, whether poor or rich.
yes.
There's a different experience associated with that. How this is evolved is into several things, right? This colorblind approach that disallows us from addressing things that if we're colorblind, then how do we look at health disparity? How do we look at the fact that the infant mortality rate for Black children is 3 times that of white children? How do we look at that if we're colorblind? And not to mention that I want you to see my Blackness. I'm very proud of it. I love it.
Yes.
And if you're saying you're colorblind, that means you're intentionally trying to not see who I
Mm,
am. 'Cause that's a part of my lived experience regardless of whether you wanna see it or acknowledge it or not, right? A lot of people think that if we ignore race, that we can just treat everyone equally, but that just we know that's not the case. We know that's not a real thing. If we're colorblind, then so are our policies.
Yes.
So are the ways that we do things, and that just completely ignores the lived experience of being a person of color.
Can I highlight 2 things you said that I think are so important? The first one was you talked about it still permeates whether you're rich or poor, right? You said
Mhm.
that, and I love the fact that you highlighted that because so many people want to simply move to classism, right? Well, can we just eradicate all these issues if we just look at
Nope.
class? And you just hit it right on the head. And they need to understand that while class is a very relevant demographic, a very
Mhm.
relevant research point, a way to enter and think about this, that it does not take care of it. And the other line that you use that I picked up on as soon as you said it is when they say, I don't see you as somebody different than me. And really, that first half of the sentence is what you hit on in the end. What they're really saying is, I don't see you.
So, one of the reasons why it's important to center race and equity work is just because of the disparity. We could look at any measure between white and Black Americans and everyone in between.
Right, right,
There are disparities that are racially aligned in just about any area, including criminal justice, wealth, education, health. So it's probably important to introduce some of that data into the conversation because I think that's a big case as to why we need to talk about race.
right,
There's a
right.
reason why this data is racially aligned. For example, white households possess around 80% of total wealth, while Black households only possess about 4.7%. Just as a beginning statistic, there's a huge wealth gap.
Right,
A
right.
Pew study found it took a look at households that have no wealth or were in debt. They found that 1 in 10 US households, 11%, either had 0 wealth or were in debt. That's
Wow.
for all people, 11%, okay? Black households are the most likely to be in this situation,
Uh-huh.
with 24% of Black households either having no wealth or being in debt compared to 9% of white households. So not only is the wealth gap real, but there's a debt gap that I don't think I've never even heard that statistic about
Me neither.
the debt, right? I think that's important when we start talking about wealth for sure. But that means that not only are we more likely to not have wealth, but we're more likely to be actively climbing out of debt
Out of
despite no matter the income, right? Because you
right,
could
right,
be making a lot, but still be in
right.
a lot of debt.
You make a good point because somebody who's making deep in some six figures may have some student loans that's deeper into some six
Right.
figures, as opposed to another person who's making six figures, but doing it without any student loans, right? Family paid for it. They got
Exactly.
cachet. And so both are high income, but that doesn't mean that that debt load is an extremely different and disproportionate.
Because what does it matter if that wealth isn't accumulating, isn't being passed on. And then we could talk about all the reasons why those disparities exist. I think that's another podcast because I don't want to leave the impression that there's inherently some reason that
Mm,
these disparities exist. That,
mhm,
for example, Black people are in poorer health
mhm,
because,
mhm.
it was for a long time believed that we just had high blood pressure genetically while there is research now that suggests that being Black in America is stressful, and that is
She
probably
says with stress in her voice. It's stressful.
I wanna make sure that we're clear that although we acknowledge that these disparities exist, that these disparities don't exist because there is something inherent within the race. It
Yeah.
is systemic, right? And regardless of the causes, it's important to talk about these things because these disparities are so profound. So I know you looked up some data on education. So what did you find, Daryl? And maybe you
So
didn't find it because you're an expert. I know.
no, no, no. And I appreciate the nod as an expert in education because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and that's part of why I went and did the PhD time. but the numbers, I wanted to give resources so folks can go and chase down their own numbers as well. Because some of this data, you might find different numbers from different sources, and we want you to do your own research and come up with your own findings and discuss this with people from a place of having done the work. The work that I'm going to pull from today is from the U.S. Department of Education, which is undergoing some interesting
Mm,
changes as we speak at
mm.
this very moment.
While it
But
exists.
right, right, right. But from the data we do have, majority non-white school districts receive, get this now, majority non-white school districts receive $23 billion less than majority white districts. $23 billion less.
And so this is
Maj-
collective of all
Of,
non-white
of,
school
of-
districts? Okay.
yes, of non-white, right? Majority non-white schools receive on average.
Jesus.
The data also suggests or shows that majority white districts receive on average $2,226 more per student per year than districts with mostly students of color. Those numbers have systemic implications because when you're spending more per student per year, more per school per year, as I discussed in the first statistic, then you can provide opportunities for these students that will then provide easier access, more access into elite institutions at the graduate school level, at the
Mhm,
undergraduate and graduate school level. Because when undergraduate schools are looking for students who have had these upper level AP variety of courses that shine well on the undergraduate institution, and those courses are only being offered in certain schools based on the numbers that I just gave you, it
mhm.
allows the access to those other schools, which are now being banned from using DEI and all kinds of other initiatives to do the recruitment of these students, thanks to executive orders, right? You go back to, well, what happens when we're not doing that? We have to go back to the schools that have exactly these things, and only the schools that have these things are the numbers that I just gave you, and those are only in white majority school districts. The systemic implications are clearly drawn the more you start to disconnect the ability of schools to go beyond. Do you have, and they call that merit, right? We had a discussion in an earlier podcast about merit. They call that
I was
merit
just thinking
because
that.
you had these other classes. Well, why did you have these other classes? Because you came from one of those school districts that has that extra money to have those classes and pay those teachers and bring those people in. But we want to call it merit and we want to eliminate DEI because that is putting in unqualified students, even though they're in a school district that doesn't have the money to do those things in the first place.
That accumulation of privileges that we talked about
Mm,
before.
preach.
Mhm.
Sunday, preach.
We could also think about some of the statistics in criminal justice. In 2021, Black Americans were imprisoned at 5 times the rate of white people. American Indian and Alaskan Native individuals were imprisoned at 4 times the rate of white people. Latinx people were imprisoned at 2.5 times the rate of white people. And then we could talk about, now that's just in prison incarceration rates, right? In sentencing, there's also disparities. In 2023, Black males received sentences that were 13.4% longer than white males. Black males were 23.4% less likely to receive probation than white males. Black people were more likely to be searched than white people. Black people are more than 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for a marijuana offense than white people, even though it's perfectly legal in some states to sell out of a
Mhm,
storefront
mhm.
now.
Guess who owns them stores?
Right,
Just saying.
exactly.
I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
Exactly. And we could go through a number of other criminal justice statistics and you would find similar trends, but you get the idea that the disparities are prominent.
That's why we gotta have the talk with our children
Mhm.
early on. And that's a whole
Mm,
nother episode for y'all. Some of y'all nodding right along right now. Right now, y'all nodding going, we know about the talk. Some of y'all know.
mhm,
Some of y'all are, what are they talking about? What kind of talk? But if you don't know, ask your friend. The other area that we dive into just real quickly, and I'm a disclaimer this one a little bit, is we talked about health, right? We talked a little bit about health early in the episode. And I think about this one a lot. While I'm not an MD and I certainly don't have a PhD in health issues, I think about it a lot because my brother is a doctor who worked for the CDC and NIH and all them institutions that pull a lot of data that we're going to talk about. And is when it hits at how people feel, right? The emotional side. Sometimes they don't care about the numbers so much. but more about how they left a moment, how they felt about a moment that will last longer than throwing statistics at them. And so while I am throwing statistics, I want y'all to know I decided to for this, since we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of statistics, the statistic I'm going to focus on is infant mortality.
Mhm.
Because if there's any group that has done nothing, it's infants, right? They just came out. We can't put any blame on them for anything they've done. So, with regards to infant mortality, the overall infant mortality rate in the United States is 5.4 national, right? Across all. For white Americans, white infants, it's 4.4 per 1,000. So it's
Mm-mm.
below the national average, 4.4, right? I want you to hear these numbers: 4.4 for white, 5.4 across all. For Black infants, it is 10.6 per
Mhm.
1,000, right? Like, we're talking well past double what white infants are facing and pretty much at double what the national average is. That is a racial reality for a thing that has done nothing but try to
This is
survive.
why we say some groups care more about unborn children than born children, and for those
Amen.
that are pro-life, infant mortality rate should be a really big concern, right?
Right?
That should
Right?
be number 1 priority, right? We could also talk about the mortality rate of birthing mothers, and I don't think
Mm,
we have the statistics, but there are huge disparities there too, and everyone has probably heard about the incident that Serena Williams had when she gave birth, and if someone with her agency and access has such problems in the delivery of her child,
mhm.
imagine others. I did hear a statistic too about mortality rate of mothers that a educated Black woman is, I can't remember the number, but is substantially more likely to die during childbirth than a poor white woman. Like, so even access in education don't earn you
Mm.
a better chance at delivering your baby safely as compared to even poor white women who you would expect wouldn't have the same level of access.
Absolutely. And we've seen those statistics across a variety of institutions and platforms as well, where a Black person with a higher education, right?
Mhm.
The outcome is equal to or less than a white person with a much lower educational status, whether it's wealth, whether it's health, whether it's a variety of different. The implication that education will earn our way out of this is a false
Right.
statement.
Mhm. And,
Helps, it helps,
it
but it's still real,
helps,
right? But it's still,
and that's one reason why I push back on the keep your head down and work hard thing.
mm,
Because
what do you
that
mean?
doesn't necessarily lead to a much better outcome in a lot of
Mm.
ways. It doesn't address the systemic issue, which is really our next topic of conversation.
We have a book that's coming out in the next year or so, and I was working on that last night. I was working on that yesterday, and one of the things I was working on was the definition of systemic. So
Mhm.
Imma read the definition I wrote down as I was working on the book last night. Imma
Yeah.
read it word for word,
Get a little
just 2
preview
sentences, right?
because we
Y'all
are
getting a
as we're
preview,
working on this book, we're
right?
not exchanging a lot in the process, so we get these little glimmers of insight as we go. So, yay, I'm excited.
Systemic oppression is the result of continuous institutionalized action
Mhm.
or perspectives strategically aimed to keep a community or groups of communities beneath other communities. Systemic oppression's goal is achieved as hierarchies are established, maintained, and strengthened. That is systemic oppression.
Why is the definition and an understanding of systemic important in how we address race and equity work?
It's important that folks understand the relevance, the definition, and the history behind systemic, because for those that say it's an individual effort, we should look at each
Mhm.
person as who they are individually. Yes, we should. And remember earlier I said I'm into the and,
And
not the
mm,
or. And you have to understand that that person is identified with the community for better or for worse. And the history of that community has been created systemically. And that's been the dialogue that we've had throughout this entire episode today about the systems that have been in place since the creation of the country, right? Written into the Constitution itself that have played a role in how that person's lived experience and their generations before them's lived experiences have all put that person in the moment in time they are right now. And none of those can be ignored as we start to analyze and think about who they are, what they can do, and how we can support them in getting there.
As long as we just continue to relegate racism as a problem of individuals, we
You're right.
never get to the things that
Yes.
address those statistics we
Yes.
talked about earlier.
Can you connect all of that to DEI work?
Yeah. I think the point today is if you're doing DEI work, that it is important to center race if you're doing it in America. There's lots of ways that we can do that. And I think today the point was to make the case as to why we would center race potentially over some other frameworks that we could come at it from. And that's not to suggest that we shouldn't use other frameworks. Yes, we should also look at things from a feminist gender lens, from a class, caste type of lens. But I choose personally, because that's where we started out, to center race in my work because of the profound effect in America, in every one of our systems, in our politics, in our decision making, in how people get manipulated politically is something that we could also talk about, but I'm not going to make a big deal out of that today.
Mhm. Mhm.
But just to throw that in the pot where I personally address race in my equity work. One thing I want to start out with saying, because we have spent this entire podcast on race, is that we have to recognize the intersectionality of racial
Mhm.
equity work as well. That if we choose to center race in our DEI work, we have to do so with the understanding that no community is a monolith.
Mhm.
There's no such
Mhm.
thing as the Black voice or the Black community. We know what we mean by those terms, but I think those terms oversimplify and take for granted that there is a singular voice from which we're
Mhm.
learning and hearing
Mhm.
from. When you and I disagree all the time,
Amen.
and people within a category that, as we've already stated, is somewhat artificially placed in the first
Right.
place,
Right.
that we not get into this habit or corner of assuming that when we center racial equity in our DEI work, that we're talking about an entire community at
Right.
any
Right.
given point, because not all people of color even experience racism in the same way. Me as a
Right.
Black woman, you as a Black man, we experience racism in entirely different
Right.
ways. Even when we've swapped stories in the past, they've been very different experiences, right?
Absolutely. And I hope folks, again, maybe this is my theme today. It's the and, right? I want folks to understand the individual experiencing of all this, as you just pointed out. And I want them to recognize the demographic data that we talked about earlier. That as a community, this data suggests this is happening to these communities. And there are individual stories that show different ways that it affects or doesn't affect individual folks. I don't want it to become a one or the other. I want it
Mhm,
to be an and. So I hope folks are hearing that this episode is really about connecting those ands from the data that crosses all the demographics to the individuals. And this is why it's also important to keep collecting that data. And a lot of groups are working very hard to eliminate the collection of that data at all. Because when you
mhm.
eliminate the collection of data across different demographics, what you end up with is the majority picture is the picture.
I can get with your "and." I agree emphatically with your "and." You can't do DEI work in America without centering race. And I don't care what demographic you come from. If you're not looking or trying to get someone to help you look at things through a race lens,
Mhm.
you're not doing it right.
Right. One of the things DEI workers need to do is take a self-critical analysis or a self-critique of who they are and what privileges they bring and where they can't fully identify And in saying that they are accepting the work, who all do they need to work with to do the work? So I think as a DI professional, one of the things you need to be very attuned to is self criticism, self evaluation, so that you make sure you are not speaking for other groups to which you don't have the lived experience. And best, you're just throwing out data and demographics that you've read about, and you're not connecting it to the lived experiences. And people just see it as sterile information as opposed to the important part of connecting that sterile information to the lived experiences. The end.
When I was doing some training of a police department, I'm not a police officer, right? And so in order to understand and fulfill that work, I have to associate with someone who is an expert on police work. And in calling the right people in to do the work is exactly what you said. You have to do kind of this
Mhm,
self-awareness accounting of
mhm,
who you are and knowing your own culture, where your blind spots are. And I think that that brings me to the next point of helping clients do that
mhm.
because you have to do that for yourself, right? But you
Right,
also have to teach them to do that because when you leave
right,
the conversation, you have to be able to trust that they're able to do some of that on their own self-assessment, right? So
right,
I
right.
think addressing race in DEI work requires us to teach clients and ourselves about implicit bias and other cultural proficiency inhibitors that are related to race, such as
Mhm,
racial anxiety.
mhm.
And racial anxiety is the frustration and the apprehension and anxiousness of discussing race, that uncomfortability that we just talked about. You
Right,
have to understand cultural insecurity, that there are people that really fear being replaced.
right.
So you have to teach and understand these inhibitors like implicit bias if you're centering race in equity work. So then the last thing that I would say in terms of centering race in DEI work is to absolutely, 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 and this might be the most important thing that I say today is if you are going to center it, you have to make racial equity work a part of your culture. And the reasons for that are numerous. One, you're going to get a better result if that's meaningful to you in your organization. But also if it's not a part of organizational culture, when you do attempt to do race equity work, you will get resentment for it
Mm,
if it's not a part of the culture, if it's just something that you do occasionally. Today, we're going to do a race exercise in team building. You're going
mm-mm,
to regret that.
mhm.
You're going to regret it. And it takes a lot of work to make that a part of culture. Also, something that is very hard to do from within with no assistance, which is why I like to start with the climate assessment. And then we work our way into now that we have that data, now that we have that information, how do we center these important things, including race, in how we work on these things going forward?
One of the things I hear you talking about is making sure that organizations and institutions avoid doing performative DEI. And the performance aspect of DEI is problematic. And we saw that in the George Floyd jumping in of so many organizations doing things that weren't core to their own values to begin with, but they just wanted to be performative. They wanted to say, look, we're doing it too. And the problems that ensued are leading us to today, where
Mhm.
organizations who really weren't in the first place are now advertising that they're pulling out. And
Right.
we've already done an episode earlier about Walmart and Costco and some other organizations and how they're either in or out. So people can go back and listen to the earlier episode. If you don't have a reason for doing it, if you don't have a strategy for how you're going to engage it, don't do it.
I almost started laughing because I thought about how the Democrats took the knee with the kente cloth after George Floyd. You know, I'm gonna put that picture up. But nobody asked for Nancy Pelosi on her knee with kente cloth on. Like, nobody wanted that. Nobody asked for that. And so that's another thing about it being a part of organizational culture and avoiding performative DEI. Sometimes you just look ridiculous. And you're probably doing things oftentimes, if it's not authentic, if it's not a part of your values that nobody even asked for. I didn't need Bath and Body Works to put kente cloth print on their bottles of lotion after George Floyd died. Nobody asked for that. Nobody wanna burn a damn candle called "The Struggle is Real." And that's what we mean, like, these are laughable things now, but these were actual decisions that companies made in response to oppression and systemic problems. And nobody asked for any of that, and it's not helping anything. And so, in order to avoid those performative examples like Daryl talked about, I'm talking about, you have to make DEI and racial equity work a part of organizational culture. So, do we have any takeaways for our audience this episode?
So I think there's a few key takeaways from what we've talked about today. And the first one that I touch on is the idea of the and, right? I think I beat that down pretty well. I think I beat that horse pretty well earlier today. But the idea of the and is think about the individual and the organization or the institution. And it's this idea of, yes, we can think about the individual's role and responsibility and how they, and we both said we hate this term, right? But to the extent that they want to talk about pulling themselves up by the bootstraps and individual responsibility, that has to be combined with the and, that there are systemic and institutional roles at play that have led to why demographics exist. And if you don't deal with the demographic, the institution, the system, but only deal with the individual, you have failed miserably. So the first is think about the and. What about you?
If nothing else today, I think that we've demonstrated that race still matters. And we saw that in the data. We saw that in our discussion of what systemic means and the interplay of race in those systems. But we need to understand how critical it is in our pursuit of this work in order to do the work well. And so I'm going to keep it short and sweet and say race still matters
Mhm.
and it should be centered in equity work.
Speaking of doing the work, my one other takeaway is do the work before. Do the work before there's drama. Do the work before there's an explosion. Do the work before there's litigation. Don't wait until all of a sudden you're under the water and trying to get somebody like us to come along and pull you back on top of the water. Get ahead of it. Do it before.
And then finally, I think I would say that we acknowledge, and I think we do this often on this podcast, acknowledge that this is difficult work.
Mm,
And we acknowledge how controversial and difficult, specifically, the issue of race is in this work. However, I think we've also made the case that no matter how difficult it is, it's necessary. And even if you are a white individual doing DEI work, race still should be a cornerstone of your equity work. So the best advice that I think we have on that is, as Daryl just said, prepare,
mm,
prepare, prepare. You have to prepare. You can't just walk in and expect to do racial equity work without doing a lot of work to see what is the organization ready to handle? What is the organization willing to do? You have to do a certain level of self-preparation as we spoke about today. So my advice is to prepare and then also get help.
mhm,
Get help because it's hard,
mhm,
because you might get backlash, because there's a certain amount of racial anxiety that accompanies this, because it's overwhelming, because you're going to have to take that home every day.
mm.
Get help.
So, what are your thoughts and experiences on dealing with race and equity work? Share them in the comments.
Until next time, we encourage you to think about diversity different. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.